Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another edition of Ukraine This Week with me, Don Arlett. Trump's efforts to pressure Putin into halting the fighting have so far made no progress. Following a meeting between Steve Witkoff and the Russian president, there was talk of a possible trilateral or bilateral meeting in the United Arab Emirates, either next week or in 2 weeks, but no details of any potential agreement have been disclosed. At the same time of the recording of this episode, Trump has yet to announce secondary tariffs on countries that buy Russian energy. Before we get into this and other details with our guests, let's go ahead and watch this report from Ukraine over the past week.
Day by day, night after night, Ukrainian civilians bear the brunt of Russian attacks on their cities. On front lines, many soldiers die every day as Russian troops advance, capturing more and more territory. A glimmer of hope has emerged, however, one that could pave the way toward ending the war. U.S. President Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin have agreed to meet, with a location already decided upon.
That road was long and continues to be long, but there's a good chance that there will be a meeting very soon.
The revelation about the meeting follows a visit to Moscow by U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff. In an interview with Fox Business, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio confirmed that during Witkoff's visit, Russia clearly communicated its conditions for ending the war in Ukraine. For people on the ground in Ukraine, however, there is no going back to normalcy, even if the war ends.
You can imagine how much time we spoke with the victims and the relatives of the victims, and they asked me personally and my team when Russian soldiers and commanders, when they will be punished.
August 8th marks the deadline for Trump's ultimatum demanding Russia commit to a ceasefire. With a meeting between the two leaders approaching, questions arise about what it could mean.
Very much. Thank you. Joining us now is our guest, Mariia Zolkina, Head of Regional Security and Conflict Studies, the Ilko Kucheriv Democratic Initiatives Foundation, and Research Fellow at the London School of Economics and Political Science. Hello, and thank you so much for joining us on Ukraine This Week.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Yes, now, what do you think happened at the Witkoff-Putin meeting this week in the Kremlin? From one side, Russia says that it received an acceptable offer from the United States. From the other side, we heard Donald Trump use some of his most forceful language yet in this, since he's taken office, saying that Russia poses a big threat to U.S. national interests.
However, I would say that actions of Trump administration somehow contradicts actually this model of Russia threatening U.S. national interest, because Trump is going back right now, in my opinion, to more loyal language in speaking with Russia, and the Witkoff visit, another Witkoff visit to Russia, is another proof of that. We have to remember that Witkoff is just the cherry on the top, but there are other tracks, including Americans and Russians on both sides, which probably are even more important than Witkoff travels to Russia and his political track, which we are following. Mm-hmm. I mean that this is not just about political deal. This is not about just a ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine, moderated or brokered by U.S. This is broader topic and broader theme, including commercial interests. Let's remember that there is another track, including Dmitry from Russia, who is speaking to his counterparts in US, and this is where Russia is giving some offers to US about mineral resources, about Arctics. So this is a broader model of setting up new international order, let's say, of sharing the responsibility or actually rights to impose some, interests on international area when it comes to US on the one side and Russia on the other side. It's not just about Witkoff brokering or trying to broker the peace settlement or at least ceasefire between Ukraine and Russia.
So, okay, so if that's the case, then what should we be paying more attention to when we look at the broader picture in the news cycle?
We should be paying more attention to in what format actually the meeting will take place, whether it will take place at all, actually. If this is just a bilateral meeting between Trump on the one hand and Putin on the other hand, which seems to be a very strong political goal for Russia's President Putin, then we might be very careful about how Trump is going to be presenting interests of just US or Europe plus US, or Ukraine, US and Europe at this meeting, because we might be trapped all together here, I mean Ukraine and Europe, when we are not at the table, and security interests neither of Ukraine nor of European countries, including eastern flank of NATO and of course Baltic and Poland, this will be just not on the map, which will be just, you know, pictured and created by Russia and US.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. You know, for a long time, I mean, ever since the beginning of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, you know, we've been talking about nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. It's a lesson we all know very well in this part of the world. And we heard that again at when there was the anniversary, the third anniversary of the full-scale invasion. We heard that a lot. And then here we go. Friday coincides with this Trump ultimatum for secondary sanctions, which we still have heard nothing about. And at the same time, Trump is going to have a bilateral sit-down with Vladimir Putin. Why do you think we're not hearing the alarm bells go off about the potential for Putin and Trump to sit down and decide the fate of Ukraine?
These alarms are taking place, I believe, when it comes to Ukraine's diplomacy with European countries, including Western Europe, of course, which is trying to take more responsibility for finance and military aid to Ukraine, for instance. And this is not just about coalition of willing. This is basically about a set of governments, a row of governments who are ready to invest into Ukraine's security like they are investing in their own security. However, we have to admit that this Western Europe is not going to take the whole responsibility for what's going on if US is making a deal with Russia without taking into consideration interests of Ukraine or Europe. Both UK and France, who are considered to be kind of leaders of coalition of willing, and they actually are, they again are not as hawkish as they would need to be in case US is not a guarantor of European security and is not the main supporter of Ukraine anymore. So they are still looking back at what the US position is. They're trying to comply with what Trump wants. Moreover, they were and are still trying to please Trump with their own proposals how they will behave on European continent in case US is not financing European security anymore, or is not just going to play any greater role in European security anymore. And moreover, in this case, we have another aspect which comes to Eastern European security, which I believe is a kind of separate segment in NATO, because Eastern European flank of NATO feels more danger and more risks when it comes to Russia. And we do see that here the cooperation between these countries with Ukraine is basically proposing another agenda, a little bit different from even what UK and France think. We need more hard security, we need more support, not just to military aid to Ukraine, but towards this kind of new pillar of how we all combine our defense and security policies. Finland, Baltic states, Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, all this belt, let's say here.
Okay, so you said something very interesting about the interests of the European Union and of Ukraine. Now, from what we understand, the deal that could be on the table is that this conflict is frozen in eastern Ukraine. So the areas that Russia already occupies, it will occupy, even if it is not the entirety of the Donetsk region or the Kherson region or Zaporizhia region. Is this something that is doable in terms of Ukrainian government, President Zelensky, the Ukrainian people? Is this a way to stop or freeze the conflict right now? And if so, does it just kick the can down the road to resume the war at another day?
When it comes to current proposals, or the proposals which are on the table for basically pretty long period of time, the territorial question is really the cornerstone here, and there are acceptable and completely unacceptable formulas for Ukrainian authorities on the one hand and Ukrainian society on the other hand, which is acceptable at this very moment in exchange for a ceasefire, not a full-fledged peace settlement, is that we just try to stop the warfare and freeze the front line where it's laying right now. However, what is completely unacceptable, both for Ukrainian politicians, for whom this will be a political suicide if they agree to this, and for Ukrainian society on the other hand, is to either de jure or de facto recognize that these territories, right now being under the control of Russia, will stay as occupied territories for undefined period of time, or, which is totally taboo for Ukrainian political thought, let's say, and domestic political discussion, is that Ukraine recognizes somehow that this is now the Russian territory, which Russia illegally included into their constitution back in 2022. So Ukraine will not agree to this. And this is, I believe, some kind of controversial point for Trump administration, because on the one hand, they don't see any problem here. But they cannot offer something which does not in their competency, let's say. So Trump, as we remember earlier this year, offered Putin a pretty sympathetic formula that US, not Ukraine, but US will recognize basically the status of Crimea as a part of Russia. However, Ukraine will never do that, and that became clear as soon as this information was leaked from the closed doors discussion. And another way which is diverting us from the idea of feasibility of scenario that ceasefire or the peace settlement is going to be something very reachable in the nearest future, is that Putin is not willing basically to stop the pushing boundaries of Ukraine's sovereignty. And that's another thing which is critical for Russia, which is less critical when it comes to negotiations for US, and which is absolutely critical again, but for Ukraine from different perspective. I'm speaking about the number of Ukrainian army, the type of military aid still coming to Ukraine, even if there is a ceasefire. Russia wants no military aid, or extreme minimum of military aid to come to Ukraine in case there is a ceasefire, because what for? There is a ceasefire. And the last but not least are security guarantees for Ukraine, which are absolutely, fundamental for Ukraine. If we have a ceasefire, if we are not members of NATO, which seems to be absolutely clear at this very moment, so what kind of another security guarantees, or at least assurances, are proposed to Ukraine to assure that Ukraine will not be left one-on-one with Russia the very next day, the very next month, or even the next year, when Russia's military and defense capabilities will be still increasing and growing, especially if sanctions are lifted, and Russia will not have to look for secondary ways to, find Western technologies to bring them to Russia. So sanctions are lifted, more opportunities, more financial possibilities to bring more technologies, to buy some stuff, especially electronic stuff, from Western directly for Russia somehow. And what Ukraine will have in this case? Decreased military aid, decreased financial aid, no security guarantees. That's why the discussions on these 2 points, that Ukraine is not gonna accept and recognize official occupation of Ukrainian territories by Russia as something, de facto or de jure for the future. And Ukraine will not be ready to sign even a ceasefire deal if there is no, confirmed tracks of how Ukrainian security will be supported on a bilateral or multilateral level.
So, judging the huge, let's see, a good word for this, requirement that Trump, or the big barrier, the big hurdle that Trump is going to have to get over next week if he meets with Vladimir Putin, is this going to be achievable in the near future? Will Russia agree to back off its maximalist demands and meet Ukraine somewhere in the middle here on some of these issues that you've just highlighted?
The deal on the ceasefire is still possible. However, I wouldn't be so sure that this will be signed or agreed next week. Exactly for the reason that European countries, even they are not as hawkish as we would expect them to be right now, and Ukraine still wanting security guarantees and some military support continued to Ukraine. In this case, we still will have, the track when Ukraine plus European partners of Ukraine will be trying to persuade Trump that ceasefire deal is not worth of selling out actually something which means much more than just a temporary, tactical, and unmoderated by anyone ceasefire. Ceasefire is an instrument either for future peace settlement, broader one, which is not the case between Ukraine and Russia, for the reason that Russia doesn't actually achieve its political goals with just a ceasefire. Their political goals are much broader, about restricting Ukraine's defense capabilities and elimination of Ukraine's sovereignty, even if Ukraine is still existing as an, so to say, independent state, but totally dependent on some kind of vetoes from Russia, like they wanted in Istanbul in 2022 and repeated in Istanbul back in May and June this year exactly in their presented memorandum. But for US, ceasefire is the final goal, and that's the problem. So for this reason, I do see that the ceasefire deal is possible. However, wouldn't be sure that this is a goal achievable next week or 2 weeks from now, exactly for the reason that European countries and Ukraine will be those who would have to implement something which Trump wants to agree with Putin next week or somewhere in the nearest future. However, Trump cannot impose implementation of something which Ukraine doesn't agree to on Kyiv or on European partners of Ukraine.
Some say that if Donald Trump doesn't make a deal, if he's unsuccessful in getting to Vladimir Putin to agree to a ceasefire, that the United States will just simply walk away from the whole conflict, not support Ukraine financially or militarily, and leave this to the Europeans. What would be the dangers in that? Would the Europeans be able to own this war and to help Ukraine achieve its very reasonable goals of retaining its sovereignty and being able to exist?
This scenario of US withdrawing from the scheme of trying to find a resolution for the conflict seems one of pretty realistic ones to me. Exactly for the reason that if there is no quick result, Trump is just turning his back on the problem, pretending that he has done everything possible, but he is definitely not going to be dragged into years and years continuing negotiations, bringing no result actually. So he might be losing interest or totally losing interest, being a kind of moderator between Ukraine and Russia if there is no result right now, after he scared Russia with severe sanctions and then got back to his previous rhetoric that let's meet, let's make a deal, rather than pushing Russia towards being more constructive and being, forced to make a deal rather than willing to make a deal. However, European countries are well aware of that. And their strategy is not just to fight diplomatically and politically with Trump, bringing more arguments for him and more reasons why he and America should stay in the European security system. They are trying to be as soft as possible to persuade him that this is in the interest of US, still be active a member of NATO, and partially they have succeeded. So they have actually pleased the appetite of Trump for applauses back in Hague, almost 2 months ago at NATO summit, summit of leaders. So they have persuaded him that they can take more responsibility, but they would still need US as at least a party who is not against supporting Ukraine. And this has led to a scheme when Europeans agreed already, and they have started doing this actually this week. The first hundreds of millions already fallen on the account for these funds for military aid for Ukraine in the scheme when Americans sell their equipment, not give this for granted for Ukraine just for free. They sell this equipment to Ukraine, but somebody in the European Union or in NATO is just paying for that. And I do believe that this scheme is a pretty rational one, and is something which everyone has already agreed to. Ukraine understands that nothing will be coming for free from US, but they still, I mean, Ukrainian authorities, they still can rely on certain countries in European Union, including Coalition of Willing, the new framework for cooperation, that they will be still paying for what Americans will be selling to Ukraine. The worst case scenario is that US is not just losing interest in diplomatic efforts to find, common ground with Ukraine and Russia, but the worst case scenario is if Trump resists even selling equipment and resists and abandons sharing intelligence from US to Ukraine, which is critical for the battlefield.
Absolutely. Now, also this week, there's some developments in the southern Caucasus between Azerbaijan and Armenia. This peace deal is being signed in the White House. Is there any room for President Trump to use this as leverage in these potential talks next week with Vladimir Putin? Do you see any connections there?
I do see actually a connection between Russia has totally lost its former influence in Caucasus. They have withdrawn for a certain reason from being an active actor at a certain point with Armenia, and got blamed by Armenians for not helping them politically or even militarily at a certain point. However, if we consider what was happening in the White House as a kind of moderation, by US of this peace deal or final settlement, let's say, this will have direct impact on Trump's role as a broker between Ukraine and Russia in case there is a meeting in the coming weeks between Putin and Trump, because Trump has shown clearly that this is not just Russia who is able to broker some kind of settlements when it comes to South Caucasus.
Or Russia's
this is very
neighborhood.
critical.
And this is Russia's traditional neighborhood,
yes.
Right?
So this place is not empty, and Trump is playing bigger role in the regions or between the conflicting countries where US was not that much active before. So actually, from this point of view, Trump and Putin are very similar, in my opinion, in their political thinking. They're thinking in terms of whose sphere of influence is that or that region, who is active, who is less active, who can pretend to have some rights when it comes to brokering some, settlements or finding resolutions for some political or territorial conflicts when it comes to different regions in the world. And from this point of view, Trump has won over Putin here, just interfering, let's say, in the region or sub-region where Putin even recently considered himself to be one of the main players.
Right. Well, it's going to be interesting to see how this shakes out, but absolutely a very quick move by the United States coming in and becoming a player. Also, there are some memorandums of understanding between ExxonMobil and Azerbaijan for the development of unconventional resources. You've also have a souring of relationship between Russia and Azerbaijan over the last several months, so this will be interesting to see how it shakes out. Now, final question here about the situation on the front lines in Ukraine. Of course, we know that Vladimir Putin is going to try and push to gain as much territory as possible before any potential ceasefire. It looks like this is the strategy he's employing. What do you foresee for the areas around Pokrovsk, Chasiv Yar? The Ukrainians say that it's still not fully under Ukrainian, Russian control. But most reports, we look and see that Konstantinivka is where the next move is. So what do you think is going to happen to the front lines over the next month, two?
I wouldn't expect that the rest of the Donetsk region, which is still under the control of Ukraine, will fall under the Russian control in the months to come. I would just remind that the fall of Pokrovsk defense was predicted by many military, even not political, but military experts back in 2024, almost 1 year ago. And nothing significantly strategically has changed since that time. However, Russia has more severely started pushing on Ukraine's front line, or Ukraine's defense line, actually, when it comes to Sumy. And this is something we forget when we speak about the territorial question. There was one important leak this week about what was proposed by Witkoff to Putin. Is it kind of not just recognition of the territories de facto, belonging to Russia when it comes to part of 4 regions of Ukraine now under Russian control, but this was about kind of exchange of territories. And what exchange is possible if Ukraine does not control, Russian regions? And I do believe that this formula most probably include the idea that Ukraine is withdrawing, like Russia demands, its forces voluntarily from the territories which Russia was not able and still not able to control and to push away the Ukrainian forces from. This means Donetsk region and even part of Zaporizhia and Kherson region, which seems completely unacceptable and will not happen from Ukrainian side. In exchange, allegedly according to this formula, for Russia withdrawing from part of Kharkiv and Sumy region. And this is very dangerous scenario because from Trump logic, I do believe this is kind of possible not to enlarge the area of front line for larger areas, larger territories in Sumy, for instance. However, for Ukrainian side, this seems as completely unacceptable, and this will not be brokered by, and this will not be considered as acceptable scenario, will not be accepted by Ukrainian society. So this is kind of situation here on the battlefield that Russia is, with these negotiations with Trump, they're trying to get in a political way with using political instruments, something which they haven't been successful in to get, militarily.
Yeah. Yeah, that poses a very difficult question, what to do with the Russians that stay behind in Sumy and still in the remnants of the Kharkiv region.
Yes.
All right. Well, Mariia Zolkina, thank you so much for joining us on Ukraine This Week. Very appreciate your thoughts and insight on these matters. Thank you. And that's all the time we have on this edition of Ukraine This Week. Join us again next week for all the latest developments from the war in Ukraine. Thanks for watching, and see you then. Goodbye.